Steve Harvey shut down a racist player who insulted a black veteran, and the crowd went absolutely crazy. This wasn't just a moment of confrontation. It was a reckoning that nobody saw coming. A young athlete thought he could publicly mock decades of military service and get away with it. But he didn't realize Steve Harvey was watching every single second. What happened next would become one of the most powerful moments ever captured on camera. A moment when racism was confronted so directly, so completely, that it forced an entire room to choose a side. Stick around, because this is the story of how one man's arrogance led to his complete and total humiliation. Let me paint you a picture of a man named Marcus Johnson. He's 67 years old today, but his story doesn't start at 67. It starts 50 years ago, when he was just a teenager with a choice to make. See, Marcus grew up in the South during segregation. He watched his father work jobs that didn't pay him fairly. He watched his mother serve in white people's homes while her own children went hungry. He watched a system that was designed to keep him small, keep him quiet, keep him invisible. And one day, when he turned 18, he walked into a military recruitment office, and he made a decision that would define the rest of his life. He said, "I'm going to serve my country." But here's the thing that most people don't understand about that decision. It wasn't simple. It wasn't heroic in the way we talk about heroes in movies. It was complicated. It was painful. Because Marcus Johnson was choosing to serve a country that didn't fully want him, a country that had laws against him, a country that treated him like a second-class citizen. And yet, he said yes anyway. He put on that uniform, and he committed 50 years of his life to something bigger than himself. 50 years. That's half a century. That's a lifetime of sacrifice that most of us can't even comprehend. Over those 50 years, Marcus did things that mattered. Real things. Important things. He served in places most Americans have never heard of. He made decisions that affected lives. He carried responsibilities that would break most people. He watched friends die. He carried wounded soldiers. He stood watch in the dark, knowing that people's lives depended on his alertness, his commitment, his willingness to put himself second. And through it all, through racism, through discrimination, through a system that didn't honor him the way it honored white soldiers, Marcus Johnson kept showing up. He kept serving. He kept sacrificing. But here's what happens to people like Marcus Johnson. They become invisible. The years pass. The wars end. New generations are born. And the men and women who gave everything, they fade into the background. Nobody knows their names. Nobody remembers their sacrifice. They walk down the street and people don't recognize them. They sit in restaurants and nobody knows what they've given. They grow old and tired, and the world moves on without ever really thanking them. Marcus Johnson had become one of those invisible men. 50 years of service, and almost nobody knew his name. That's why his daughter invited him to this charity event. She thought it was time. It was time for her father to be seen. It was time for his sacrifice to be acknowledged. It was time for someone, anyone, to stand up and say, what you did mattered. Who you are matters. So Marcus got dressed that evening. He put on a suit that fit him well. He combed his hair carefully. He was nervous, to be honest with you. He didn't like attention. He didn't like being the center of focus. But his daughter asked him, and he loved his daughter, so he said yes. He would go to the event. When Marcus walked into that ballroom, something shifted inside him. The space was elegant and dignified. There were flags on the walls. There were other veterans there, men and women who had also served, who had also sacrificed, who had also been forgotten by time. Marcus looked around that room, and he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. He felt like maybe, just maybe, his service was going to be acknowledged. Like maybe, after 50 years of invisibility, someone was finally going to see him. He sat down at a table with other veterans, and for the first time in decades, he wasn't invisible. People were coming up to shake his hand. People were saying thank you. People were looking him in the eye with genuine respect. Then came the moment they had all been waiting for. Marcus was called to the front of the room. He stood up slowly. His knees aren't what they used to be. And he walked forward. The organizers presented him with a plaque. It had his name on it. Marcus Johnson, 50 years of service. And as he held that plaque in his hands, something happened. His eyes got wet, not because he was sad, but because, after all these years, someone had finally remembered. Someone had finally said, "You matter. What you did matters. You are a hero." Marcus stepped up to the microphone. His voice was steady, but it carried the weight of 5 decades. He talked about the men and women who didn't make it home. He talked about the sacrifices that most people never see. He talked about the quiet honor of showing up, day after day, year after year, doing what needs to be done even when nobody's watching, even when nobody's thanking you. He talked about why he served, not for glory, not for recognition, but because it was right. Because his country needed him. Because some things are bigger than yourself. The crowd listened in complete silence. You could feel the respect in that room. You could feel the recognition. You could feel the weight of what this man had given. When Marcus finished speaking, the applause was genuine. It wasn't polite. It wasn't obligatory. It was real people. Genuinely moved, genuinely grateful, genuinely honoring a man who had spent 50 years in service. Marcus walked back to his seat, and for the first time in 50 years, he felt seen. He felt validated. He felt like his sacrifice had finally been acknowledged by his country. He sat back down at the table with the other veterans, and he felt at peace. He felt like this evening had been worth it. He felt like maybe, just maybe, everything he had gone through had meant something. But as Marcus settled back into his seat, basking in that moment of recognition and honor, something was about to happen that would change everything he was feeling. Something was about to arrive that would shatter the peace of that room. Something that would test everything Marcus Johnson believed about dignity, about honor, about what it means to serve. And nobody in that ballroom had any idea what was coming. The ballroom was still warm with applause. People were still standing, still moved by what Marcus Johnson had shared. The energy in the room was elevated. Genuine, respectful, the kind of atmosphere you get when people have just witnessed real dignity. But that atmosphere was about to get shattered. Devin Marshall walked into the ballroom like he owned it. And I mean that literally. He walked in like he expected everyone to move out of his way, and most people did. Devin was young, probably mid-30s, and he was famous. Very famous. The kind of famous that comes from being exceptionally good at throwing a football. His suit was expensive. His watch was expensive. Everything about him screamed money and entitlement. But the first thing you noticed about Devin Marshall wasn't his wealth. It was his complete and total disconnection from what was happening around him. He was on his phone, not just glancing at his phone. He was completely absorbed in it, scrolling, checking messages, completely oblivious to the fact that this was a charity event honoring military veterans. His handlers, and yes, famous people like Devin have handlers, were trying to guide him toward the stage for a photo opportunity. This was purely optics for Devin. He was there for the pictures. He was there so he could post something on social media about how much he cares about veterans. He was there to look good. He wasn't there because he actually cared. As Devin walked through the ballroom, he looked around with barely concealed disdain. You could see it in his face. He was uncomfortable. He was surrounded by old people, people who had lived real lives, who had real stories, who had real sacrifice. And Devin Marshall had no patience for that. He made a comment to one of his handlers under his breath. "What is this? A nursing home?" His handler tried to laugh it off, but you could see the discomfort on his face. He knew what was coming. He knew that Devin in a bad mood was a problem. Devin was led to his seat, which happened to be right next to the veterans' table. This was fate playing a cruel joke, honestly. This was the universe setting up a collision course. Devin sat down, still on his phone, still completely disconnected from the fact that he was sitting next to men who had literally risked their lives for their country. One of the other athletes at his table tried to make conversation with him about the event. Devin brushed him off. Yeah, it's nice," he said dismissively. "But can we hurry this up? I've got somewhere to be later." The disrespect was starting to become obvious to people around him. Other guests were noticing. The veterans at the nearby table were noticing. You could see it in their faces, the hardening of their expressions, the way their jaws clenched. These men had spent 50 years being invisible, being overlooked, being forgotten. And now they were in a room where they were finally being honored. And this arrogant young man was sitting right next to them, completely dismissing the entire event. It was a particular kind of insult that only made sense if you understood what these men had given up. Then Devin made a comment that changed the entire temperature of the room. He looked over at Thomas, one of the older veterans, and he said it loud enough for people around him to hear. "I don't get it, honestly. These guys are sitting here talking about how hard their lives were, like they made some incredible sacrifice. But come on, they're old now. They didn't become anything. They're just regular guys talking about glory days." The words hung in the air like poison. Several people at nearby tables went silent. They had heard what Devin said, and they were horrified. Thomas stood up from his chair. He was shaking, not from fear, but from rage. 50 years of invisibility. 50 years of sacrifice. 50 years of being overlooked. And this kid who had done nothing but throw a ball and make money, was dismissing his entire life as irrelevant. Colonel Sarah Pierce, who was sitting at the same table, put her hand on Thomas's arm. "Don't," she said, quietly. "He's not worth it." But the damage was done. The peace had been shattered. The recognition that Marcus had just felt, the validation that had just washed over him, it was being replaced by something else. Anger, humiliation, disrespect. But Devin wasn't done. Not even close. He stood up from his table, and he walked directly over to the veterans' table. He was tall, he was muscular, he was physically intimidating, and he was using that physicality as a weapon. He stood there, towering over these men who were sitting down, and he spoke loud enough for the entire ballroom to hear. "I'm trying to understand what we're even doing here," he said, looking directly at Thomas and Marcus. "You guys served your country 50 years ago. Okay, congratulations. But you didn't become anything. You didn't make anything of yourselves. So what exactly are we honoring?" The words hit like physical blows. The entire ballroom had gone silent. People weren't eating anymore. People weren't talking. Everyone was watching. Everyone was witnessing this moment. This was no longer a private conversation. This was a public humiliation happening in front of hundreds of people. And Devin Marshall seemed to be enjoying it. He was smirking. He was standing there with his arms crossed, clearly feeling powerful, clearly feeling superior. Colonel Pierce was on her feet now. "You need to sit down," she said, her voice low but dangerous. She was a military woman. She knew how to handle conflict. But Devon just laughed. An actual laugh. Like this old woman standing up to him was the most amusing thing he had heard all night. "What are you going to do?" he asked mockingly. "What exactly are you going to do about it?" The implication was clear. These were old people, and he was young and strong, and he didn't fear them. Marcus was standing now too. His hands were clenched into fists at his sides. 50 years of invisibility, finally broken by recognition, and now being shattered by this kid's cruelty. The other veterans were standing. The entire table was standing, and Devon Marshall was standing in the middle of them, completely unafraid, completely arrogant, completely convinced that he was untouchable. Security was starting to move toward the table. But something was holding them back. Maybe they wanted to see where this was going. Maybe they were waiting for it to escalate before they intervened. Or maybe, just maybe, they were about to see something that would make them hesitate. Because nobody in that moment knew what was about to happen. Nobody knew that Steve Harvey had been watching this entire exchange from across the ballroom. Nobody knew that everything was about to change. Steve Harvey had been watching the entire thing unfold. He was standing near the back of the ballroom, away from the main crowd, observing the event with the kind of attention that comes from someone who has spent decades reading people, understanding dynamics, and knowing exactly when something is about to go wrong. And he saw it coming. He saw Devon's arrogance from the moment the kid walked in. He saw the disrespect building. He saw the moment when Devon decided to use his power and his youth as a weapon against men who had sacrificed everything. But Steve didn't move. Not yet. He wanted to see how the veterans would respond. He wanted to see if they could handle this themselves. Because there's a difference between being a spectator and being a participant. And Steve understood that distinction. He watched as Thomas stood up. He watched as Colonel Pierce stepped in. He watched as Marcus clenched his fists. And then he watched as Devon, this kid who had never been told no in his entire life, stood up and walked over to them like he owned the room. That's when Steve knew it was time. Steve Harvey is not a small man. He's tall, he's imposing, and when he moves, people notice. But more importantly, Steve Harvey is someone that people listen to. He's built a career on understanding human nature, on calling people out when they're wrong, on using his platform and his voice to speak truth. And in that moment, as he watched a young man publicly humiliate veterans in a room full of people, Steve Harvey made a decision. This was his moment. This was what he was here for. Steve walked across that ballroom with the kind of purpose that makes people move out of the way. His face wasn't angry, not yet. His face was calm. His face was measured. But his face was also completely certain. He walked directly toward the table where Devon was standing over the veterans, and he didn't stop until he was standing right next to him. Close enough that Devon could feel his presence. Close enough that the entire room could see what was happening. "Excuse me," Steve said. His voice was quiet, but it carried weight. It carried authority. It carried the kind of power that comes from someone who doesn't need to yell to be heard. "I need you to listen to what I'm about to say, and I need you to listen very carefully." Devon turned to look at Steve, and for the first time, you could see a flicker of something in his face. Uncertainty, maybe. Or the first moment of realizing that he might have pushed things too far. Steve looked at the veterans, at Thomas, at Marcus, at Colonel Pierce, at all the men and women who were standing at that table. And then he looked back at Devon. These men, Steve said, gesturing toward them, have given more in one day of their service than you will give in your entire lifetime. And I don't say that to insult you. I say that as a fact, as a statement of truth. Steve's voice was still quiet, but it was getting stronger. You could hear the certainty in every word. You stand here, in this room, looking at men who have sacrificed their health, their time, their lives, their peace of mind. Some of them lost limbs in service to this country. Some of them lost friends. Some of them lost years. They can never get back. And you have the audacity, the actual audacity, to stand in front of them and tell them they didn't accomplish anything? Steve shook his head slowly. That tells me everything I need to know about you. Devin tried to interrupt. Look, I was just... But Steve held up his hand, a single hand gesture that silenced the entire room. No, you don't get to talk right now. You had your turn. Now it's my turn. Steve stepped closer to Devin. Close enough that Devin had to look up at him slightly. Close enough that the physical dynamics had completely shifted. Do you know what a hero is? Steve asked. Because I don't think you do. I think you think a hero is someone who gets famous, someone who makes money, someone who gets their picture in the papers. But that's not what a hero is, Steve continued. A hero is someone who does hard things even when nobody's watching. A hero is someone who sacrifices because it's right, not because it's profitable. A hero is someone who shows up day after day, year after year, and does their job even when that job costs them everything. And that's what these men did. That's what these women did. They were heroes, not because they wanted to be. They were heroes because they understood that some things are more important than yourself. Steve pointed directly at Devin. And you stand here with your expensive suit and your famous name, and you dismiss them. You think that makes you powerful? You think that makes you impressive? Steve's voice was rising now, but it wasn't out of control. It was rising because the emotion of the moment was building. It was rising because the truth of what he was saying demanded to be heard. Let me tell you something. Power isn't about how much money you have. Power isn't about how famous you are. Power is about character. And character is something you earn. Character is something you build through sacrifice, through honor, through doing the right thing, even when nobody's looking. These men have character, Steve said, turning slightly to look at the veterans. You don't. Not yet. Maybe you will someday. Maybe you'll figure out what actually matters in life. Maybe you'll understand that your platform, your fame, your money, all of that is meaningless if you don't have character to back it up. But right now, you're just a kid with a big ego and no perspective. Devin's face was red. He was angry now, but he was also scared. You could see it in his eyes. He had never been spoken to like this before. He had never been called out so publicly, so completely, so thoroughly. Steve Harvey wasn't just criticizing him. Steve was dismantling him. Steve was taking apart his entire worldview and showing him how empty it was. I want you to do something, Steve said. I want you to look at these men. Actually look at them. Look at Thomas. Look at Marcus. Look at Colonel Pierce. These are people who have earned the right to be proud. These are people who have given everything. And you're going to stand here and you're going to apologize. Not because I'm telling you to. Not because it will look good for your image. You're going to apologize because it's the right thing to do. For a moment, nothing happened. Devin just stood there, his face red, his fists clenched, his entire body shaking. And then, and this is when the moment truly shifted, Devin opened his mouth. And what came out was an apology. Not a good apology. Not a heartfelt apology, but an apology nonetheless. I'm sorry, he said, barely audible. I didn't mean to disrespect you. I was wrong. But Steve wasn't done. No, Steve said. Say it like you mean it. Say it looking them in the eye. And Devin did. He turned to face the veterans directly. He looked at Thomas. He looked at Marcus. He looked at Colonel Pierce. And with his voice shaking, he said it again. I'm sorry. What I said was wrong. You deserve respect. You deserve honor. I was arrogant and I was cruel, and I'm sorry. The silence that followed was profound, complete, total. The entire ballroom had been holding its breath, and now everyone was exhaling at the same time. Steve Harvey had done something that seemed impossible. He had taken a moment of humiliation and transformed it into a moment of truth. He had taken an arrogant young man and forced him to confront his own emptiness. And he had done it with words, with conviction, with a kind of moral authority that can only come from someone who actually understands what honor means. Steve put his hand on Devin's shoulder. Now, you're going to sit down, Steve said, his voice calm again. You're going to sit down, and you're going to be quiet. And maybe, if you're lucky, these people will teach you something tonight about what really matters in life. Devin nodded, and he turned and walked back to his table. And as he sat down, the entire room seemed to breathe again. The moment Devin sat down, something shifted in that ballroom. It wasn't just relief. It wasn't just satisfaction at seeing an arrogant person finally get called out. It was something deeper. It was the collective recognition that something real had just happened. Something true had just been spoken into existence. And that recognition needed to find an outlet. It started with one person. A woman in the middle of the ballroom. She stood up. And she started clapping. Not polite clapping, real clapping. The kind of clapping that comes from the gut, that comes from witnessing something that matters. Then another person stood up. Then another. Then another. Within seconds, the entire ballroom was on its feet. Hundreds of people, standing, applauding, their hands coming together in a rhythm that felt like a heartbeat. Like the room itself was alive. But it wasn't just Steve Harvey they were applauding. Yes, Steve was standing there, and yes, people were honoring his courage in speaking up. But the applause was also for the veterans. The applause was a recognition of what Steve had just articulated. That these men and women in the room had sacrificed in ways that most people could never understand. The applause was a collective, we see you, we respect you, we honor you. And after 50 years of invisibility, that recognition was overwhelming. Marcus Johnson was crying. Not the small, dignified tears of earlier when he received his plaque. These were deep, shaking tears. The kind of tears that come when something inside you breaks open and all the emotion you've been carrying for decades comes pouring out. 50 years of service. 50 years of being overlooked. 50 years of showing up and doing what needed to be done without recognition. And in one moment, everything had shifted. He was seen. He was validated. He was honored in a way that penetrated deep into his soul. Colonel Pierce had her hand on Marcus's shoulder, and she was crying too. Thomas was standing with his hand over his heart. The other veterans were embracing each other. They were laughing and crying at the same time. Because this wasn't just about what had happened in the last few minutes. This was about a lifetime of service finally being acknowledged. This was about sacrifice finally being honored. This was about invisibility finally being broken. Steve Harvey stood there, watching it all unfold. He wasn't basking in the attention. He wasn't taking a bow or playing to the crowd. He was simply standing there, witnessing what he had created. A moment of genuine human connection. A moment where truth had been spoken and people had responded to that truth. Steve looked at the veterans, and he nodded slowly. Not a gesture of superiority, a gesture of respect. A gesture that said, "You were worth it. Your sacrifice was worth it." But then something unexpected happened. The applause didn't stop. It kept going and going. The crowd wasn't just clapping anymore. They were cheering. People were shouting, "That's right. Thank you. We see you." The words were coming from the crowd, directed at the veterans, directed at Steve, directed at the moment itself. The emotional energy in the room had reached a crescendo that was almost overwhelming. Some of the younger people in the crowd, people in their 20s and 30s, were crying because they were witnessing something that their generation didn't see very often. They were witnessing genuine honor, genuine respect, genuine recognition of sacrifice. In a world that celebrates celebrity and money and status, they were seeing something real, something that actually mattered. And that realization was moving them in ways they couldn't fully articulate. A young man, maybe 25 years old, pushed through the crowd. He walked directly to where Marcus was standing, and he said, "Thank you. Thank you for everything you gave up so that I could have the freedom to be here." Marcus embraced him. And that embrace, that simple, human connection between a veteran and a young person who understood his sacrifice, became emblematic of what was happening in that room. The generations were connecting. The sacrifice was being acknowledged. The invisible were becoming visible. Then a woman stood up. She was probably in her 60s, and she was shaking as she spoke. "I lost my father in Vietnam," she said, her voice carrying across the now quieter room. "He was a veteran like you, and he came home and nobody thanked him. Nobody honored him, and he struggled for the rest of his life because he felt like his service didn't matter. I wish he was here to see this. I wish he was here to feel what you're feeling right now." She looked directly at the veterans' table. "Thank you for showing the world what real sacrifice looks like." Other people started sharing their own stories. A man whose grandfather had served. A woman whose brother had died in active duty. A young person whose parent had come home with PTSD and had struggled to reintegrate into civilian life. The stories kept coming, and with each story, the emotional weight in the room grew heavier. This wasn't just about one moment anymore. This was about a collective reckoning with the fact that veterans had been invisible for too long, that their sacrifice had been taken for granted, that the nation owed them a debt that could never be fully repaid. The energy in the room was electric now. It wasn't angry. It wasn't aggressive. It was something more profound. It was love. It was gratitude. It was the recognition of human sacrifice and human dignity. People were moving toward the veterans' table. Not to take pictures for social media, not to use the moment, but to genuinely honor these men and women. To shake their hands, to say thank you, to look them in the eye and communicate something that had been missing for 50 years. Devin Marshall was sitting at his table, watching it all happen. His face was ashen. His arrogance had been completely stripped away. He was witnessing something that his money and his fame and his status could never buy him access to. Genuine human respect, earned through sacrifice and integrity. He was watching people honor real heroes, and he was understanding, for probably the first time in his life, that he wasn't one of them, that his accomplishments, which he had always thought were so significant, were actually meaningless in comparison to what these veterans had done. Steve Harvey moved toward the stage, and when he stepped up to the microphone, the crowd quieted. Not because they had to, but because they wanted to hear what he had to say. Because they had been moved by his words before, and they wanted to be moved by them again. "What we just witnessed," Steve said, his voice carrying through the ballroom, "was what happens when truth meets courage. These men and women sacrificed. They gave their lives in service to something bigger than themselves. And for too long, we, as a nation, have taken that for granted. But that changes tonight," Steve continued. "Tonight, we say to every veteran in this room, and to every veteran watching, that your service matters. Your sacrifice matters. You matter. And we're not going to forget you anymore. We're not going to let you become invisible anymore. Because what you've given us, the freedom to be here, the security to live our lives, that's the greatest gift that can ever be given. And it deserves to be honored." The crowd erupted again, but this time it was different. This time it was a commitment. It was a promise. It was the collective voice of a room saying, "We see you. We honor you. We will never forget you again." And as that sound washed over the veterans, as that recognition that they had been waiting 50 years to feel finally arrived, something inside them shifted. They stood taller. They cried harder. They felt, for the first time in half a century, like they were truly home. The applause was still echoing through the ballroom, but the energy was starting to shift. The initial emotional explosion had reached its peak, and now people were beginning to process what had actually happened. The moment was becoming memory, and in that transition, something else was emerging. The reality of consequences. Devin Marshall was still sitting at his table, but he was no longer invisible. Every eye that could see him was watching him, watching how he was handling the humiliation, watching whether he would try to recover his reputation or whether he would simply sit there, diminished and alone. His handlers were pulling their phones out, checking social media. Their faces were getting darker. Whatever was being said online, it wasn't good for Devin. In fact, it was catastrophic. By the time Devin checked his own phone, which he finally worked up the courage to do about 10 minutes after Steve's speech, the damage was already done. Videos of the confrontation were spreading across social media at speeds that were almost incomprehensible. Millions of views, hundreds of thousands of shares. And the comments were brutal. People weren't defending him. People weren't making excuses for him. People were calling him out, calling him disrespectful, calling him a coward, calling him everything he had feared being called his entire privileged life. News outlets were already running the story. Famous athlete publicly called out for disrespecting veterans. The headlines were everywhere, and each headline was more damaging than the last. The narrative was forming in real time, and Devin was the villain. The disrespectful kid who had insulted heroes, the entitled athlete who had confused money with character. The perfect embodiment of everything wrong with celebrity culture. Shallow, arrogant, and completely disconnected from anything that actually mattered. His team was in crisis mode. His publicist was making phone calls. His agent was strategizing damage. Control. But there was nothing to control. The damage wasn't something that could be spun or reframed or explained away. The damage was truth. And truth, once it's spoken and witnessed by hundreds of people and broadcast to millions more, doesn't get taken back. It doesn't disappear. It becomes part of the story. It becomes part of who you are. Some of Devin's endorsement deals were already falling through. Companies that had paid millions for his name and his image were pulling out. Why? because association with him was now toxic, because he'd become a symbol of disrespect, and companies didn't want their products associated with that. The money that had always come so easily was starting to disappear. And for the first time, Devin was understanding that consequences were real, that actions had reactions, that you couldn't just move through the world insulting people and expecting everything to be fine. But the real consequence, the one that would haunt him for years, was something different entirely. It was the loss of something he could never get back. Respect. Respect isn't something you can buy. You can't hire a team of people to manufacture it. You can't post the right things on social media to earn it back quickly. Respect is something that takes years to build and can be destroyed in seconds. And Devin Marshall had just destroyed his in front of hundreds of witnesses and millions of viewers. Meanwhile, on the other side of the ballroom, something completely different was happening. The veterans were being lifted up. The video of Steve calling out Devin, of speaking truth about sacrifice and honor, was being celebrated. Military communities were sharing it. Veteran organizations were sharing it. Politicians were starting to talk about it. And the narrative wasn't about Devin anymore, not for the veterans. The narrative was about recognition. It was about finally being seen. It was about a nation saying, "We were wrong to forget you, and we're sorry." Veteran support organizations were getting flooded with donations. People who had been moved by what happened in that ballroom were putting their money where their mouth was. They were supporting the very people who had been invisible for so long. Mental health resources for veterans, housing programs, education initiatives. All of it was seeing a surge in funding because people had been reminded of what they owed. Because Steve Harvey had articulated something that most people felt but didn't know how to express. That veterans deserved more than applause. They deserved action. They deserved resources. They deserved a nation that actually honored its promises to them. Marcus Johnson's phone started ringing the next morning. Offers were coming in. Speaking engagements, book deals, media appearances. Suddenly, his story mattered to people. Suddenly, his 50 years of service were being recognized as significant. But Marcus wasn't interested in turning his sacrifice into a commodity. He turned down most of the offers. What he was interested in was using his platform, this unexpected platform that had been given to him, to advocate for other veterans who were still invisible. To speak up for the people who hadn't had their moment in a ballroom with a famous person to defend them. Colonel Pierce was contacted by veteran advocacy groups asking her to join their boards, to lend her voice and her experience to the work of actually changing things for veterans. She said yes, because this moment had reminded her why she had served in the first place. Because some things are bigger than yourself. And now, in the evening of her life, she had another chance to serve. She had another chance to make a difference. The other veterans at the table, Thomas, and the others whose names we haven't spoken yet, but whose sacrifices are just as real. They all found themselves in a similar position. They suddenly mattered to people. They suddenly had a voice that people wanted to hear. And they all faced the same choice. Would they use this moment for themselves, or would they use it for something bigger? Every single one of them chose bigger. But there was something else happening too. Something that was less visible, but perhaps more important. Young people were starting to pay attention to military service. Young people were starting to understand that there was something noble about sacrifice, that there was something honorable about putting yourself second. The military recruitment offices started reporting an uptick in inquiries. Not from people looking for glory or money, but from people who had been moved by what they had witnessed. People who wanted to be part of something that mattered. The video of Steve Harvey confronting Devon Marshall became something larger than a moment of public humiliation. It became a teaching tool. It became something that people showed in schools, in community centers, in military training facilities. It became a moment of cultural reckoning, a moment where a nation had to look at itself and ask, what do we really value? What do we really honor? Do we honor sacrifice, or do we honor celebrity? Do we honor service, or do we honor status? And the answer for most people was clear. Sacrifice mattered more. Service mattered more. Honor mattered more. And that realization was changing things. Not overnight, not perfectly, but it was changing things. Devon Marshall, meanwhile, was having a very different experience. His sponsors were gone. His endorsement deals were evaporating. Teams were distancing themselves from him. The question wasn't whether he would be able to continue his career. It was whether anyone would want him on their team at all. His talent as an athlete hadn't changed. His abilities were the same as they had always been. But his value in the marketplace had plummeted because the marketplace was sending a message. Character matters. And if you don't have it, we don't want you. Some people in Devon's world were telling him to double down, to attack Steve Harvey, to claim that he had been taken out of context, to play the victim, to make it about how unfairly he had been treated. But Devon, to his credit, wasn't doing that. He was quiet. He was trying to understand what had happened. He was starting, for the first time in his life, to wonder whether maybe his way of moving through the world had been wrong. It would take him time to actually change. It would take him a long time to earn back any kind of respect or credibility. But the seed had been planted. The confrontation with Steve Harvey had cracked something open inside him. And in that crack, there was the possibility of growth. 3 weeks later, Devon Marshall walked back into a public space for the first time since the incident. He wasn't there because he wanted to be. He was there because his team had convinced him that complete silence and invisibility would be worse than facing people directly. He was there because hiding wasn't going to fix anything. So he showed up to a charity event, not the same one, a different one. And he walked in knowing that every eye in the room would recognize him. Every person would know who he was, and every person would judge him. The room went quiet when he entered. Not a dramatic, movie-like quiet where everyone stops talking at exactly the same moment. But a real quiet. A quiet where conversations died naturally, where people's eyes found him, where the energy shifted. Devon walked to his seat, a seat that his team had arranged, a seat that was public enough that he couldn't hide, but not so public that he was directly in the spotlight. He sat down. He didn't look around. He didn't try to engage with people. He just sat there and waited. Then Steve Harvey walked in. Not because he had planned to be there, not because he was scheduled to speak, but because he was a guest at the event, and he had arrived separately from Devon. The two men's eyes met across the room, and in that moment, something shifted. This wasn't about the crowd anymore. This wasn't about social media or endorsement deals or public opinion. This was about two human beings recognizing each other. This was about Devon finally understanding, in a complete and visceral way, what he had done. Steve didn't approach Devon immediately. Instead, Steve moved through the room, greeting people, shaking hands, being the consummate professional and public figure that he had always been. But his presence was a weight in the room. His presence was a reminder, and Devon felt it with every fiber of his being. Because Devon understood now what he hadn't understood before. Steve Harvey wasn't his enemy. Steve Harvey was his teacher. And sometimes teachers have to be harsh in order for the lesson to penetrate. After about an hour, Steve approached Devin's table. He didn't sit down. He just stood there, next to Devin's chair, looking down at him. Devin stood up, not out of respect necessarily, but out of instinct. Out of the understanding that you don't stay seated when Steve Harvey is standing in front of you. The two men faced each other. The room had gone quiet again. But this time, it was different. This time, people wanted to see what would happen next. "How are you doing?" Steve asked. And it wasn't asked mockingly. It wasn't asked as a public performance. It was asked genuinely. Like Steve actually wanted to know how Devin was handling the fallout from what had happened 3 weeks ago. "I've been better," Devin said quietly. His voice was different now. The arrogance was gone. The confidence was gone. What remained was something more vulnerable, something more real. "I've lost a lot. My sponsors, my reputation. People won't even look at me anymore." Steve nodded slowly. "You know what you lost?" he asked. "You know what the real loss is?" Devin shook his head. "You lost something that took you 35 years to build, and it took you about 5 minutes to destroy. You lost the benefit of the doubt. You lost the assumption that you were a good person. You lost the luxury of not having to prove your character. But here's what I want to tell you," Steve continued. And his voice was getting stronger now, more authoritative. "Losing that is the best thing that could have happened to you. Because now you have a choice. You can spend the rest of your life trying to get back what you lost, your reputation, your sponsorships, your status, and you'll always be chasing something that you destroyed. Or you can build something new. You can build actual character, real character, the kind that can't be bought and can't be faked and can't be destroyed, because it's built on a foundation of integrity." "What do you mean?" Devin asked. And he genuinely wanted to know. He wasn't being defensive anymore. He was being open. He was being receptive. "I mean," Steve said, "that you have an opportunity right now that most people don't get. Most people go through their entire lives never having their values tested, never having their character questioned, never having to confront the fact that they might be empty inside. You've been confronted with that fact, and now you get to choose whether you're going to stay empty or whether you're going to actually become something." Steve pulled up a chair and sat down, and in that moment, something significant shifted. This wasn't a public confrontation anymore. This was a conversation. This was a moment of genuine human connection between two people who had been on opposite sides of a conflict. "I'm going to ask you something," Steve said, "and I want you to think before you answer. Why do you think those veterans mattered so much to people? Why do you think people were so moved by their recognition?" Devin thought about it, really thought about it. "Because they sacrificed," he said finally. "Because they gave up things that mattered to them for something bigger than themselves." "Exactly," Steve said. "They sacrificed. They put themselves second. And in a world where everything is about getting more, having more, being more, that sacrifice is profound. That sacrifice is rare. And that sacrifice is what actually earns respect." Steve leaned forward. "You have the opportunity right now to do the same thing. You have the opportunity to sacrifice your need to get your reputation back, to sacrifice your need to prove people wrong, and instead put your energy toward actually becoming a person of character." "But how?" Devin asked. "How do I do that?" And this is where the moment became truly significant. because Steve didn't answer with platitudes. Steve didn't tell Devin to do some charity work and everything would be fine. Instead, Steve said something that would echo through Devin's life for decades. You start by understanding that you don't deserve forgiveness. You don't deserve redemption. You don't deserve a second chance. Those are things that have to be earned. And earning them means being willing to do things that nobody will ever thank you for. It means serving people who will never know your name. It means building character in the moments when nobody's watching. The room was completely silent now, because people had realized what was happening. They weren't watching a confrontation anymore. They were watching a transformation. They were watching a young man begin to understand something that most people spend their entire lives trying to avoid understanding. That character is built in private. That integrity is something you live when nobody's looking. That true respect can only come from genuine sacrifice. Steve stood up. "I'm going to give you a number," he said. "It's for a veterans organization. I want you to call them, and I want you to tell them that you want to help. Not for publicity, not for a photo op, not for social media. For real. And then I want you to show up and do the work. And I want you to keep showing up day after day, year after year, until you're the kind of person who actually understands what sacrifice means." Devin took the number. His hand was shaking as he wrote it down. "Will it fix things?" he asked. "Will it get my sponsors back? Will it fix my reputation?" Steve looked at him directly. "No," he said simply. "It won't. Some things, once broken, stay broken. Your reputation as an arrogant kid who insulted heroes, that's going to follow you for the rest of your life. But you can build a new reputation. You can become someone who actually matters, someone who actually makes a difference. And that matters infinitely more than being famous." And then Steve Harvey walked away. He moved back through the room, and the conversation started again. People began talking to each other once more. The moment was over. But something profound had shifted. Because everyone in that room had just witnessed something real. They had witnessed a confrontation that had transformed into a teaching moment. They had witnessed someone being given the most difficult gift that can be given, the opportunity to change. Devin looked down at the number in his hand, and he made a decision right there, in that moment, in front of everyone. He was going to call. He was going to show up. He was going to begin the long, difficult work of building actual character. Not because it would fix things, but because Steve had made him understand something that he had never understood before. That fixing things wasn't the point. Becoming someone worth fixing was the point. And as that realization washed over him, Devin Marshall finally understood what the veterans had known all along. He understood that sacrifice matters. He understood that service matters. He understood that the only way to truly matter in this world is to put yourself second and something bigger first. It would take him years to actually live that understanding. But the seed had been planted. The truth had penetrated. And the transformation had begun. The video of Steve's conversation with Devin that night spread across social media just as fast as the original confrontation had. But this time, the narrative was different. This wasn't about humiliation. This was about redemption. This was about the possibility of change. This was about someone being given a chance to become better. And millions of people watched it and thought about their own lives, about their own choices, about what they were actually building with the time they had been given. The veterans watched it too. And they understood something that nobody else quite grasped. They understood that Steve Harvey had done something extraordinary. He hadn't just defended them. He hadn't just called out disrespect. He had taken a moment of conflict and transformed it into a teaching moment. He had used that moment to remind the entire world of something essential. That some things matter more than money, more than fame, more than status. Some things matter because they require sacrifice. And sacrifice is the only thing that actually builds a meaningful life. Marcus Johnson was watching when the video went viral. He saw Steve's conversation with Devin, and he cried again. Not tears of pain this time. Tears of understanding, tears of recognition. Because he understood that something was changing in the world. Something fundamental was shifting. People were starting to remember what mattered. People were starting to understand that sacrifice and service and honor weren't old concepts. They were timeless. They were eternal. And they were more valuable than anything that money could buy. The final image of this story isn't Devin becoming a perfect person. It's not a neat resolution where everything gets fixed and everyone lives happily ever after. The final image is Devin, 3 months later, working at a veterans center, working without cameras, working without recognition, working because it was the right thing to do. And as he's helping an elderly veteran fill out paperwork for housing assistance, he sees something in that veteran's eyes. He sees gratitude. He sees respect. He sees the beginning of something he had never earned before. Not fame, not status, but actual, genuine human respect. And that, finally, is worth more than all the endorsement deals in the world.